Okay. Okay, so here's part two of choosing U.S. holidays, part two. So we talked about Columbus Day, and I'm sure some people got a little irritated with some of the things I said, but I'm just going based on history and truth. It's not so much about my personal convictions, it's just about knowledge. All right, so now let's look at another human another national holiday that's connected to someone who's a human being. So we have President's Day, which happens around February, and that holiday originally started out with just being about George Washington, and then eventually began to include Abraham Lincoln. And let's talk about that. So when you think President's Day, think George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. President's Day is not just about celebrating every single president of America. And I just really need people to read. I need you to stop just thinking about what somebody's posted on TikTok or what the news may say. Like there are resources. There are primary documents. There are things you can read and for yourself to figure out everything I'm sharing with you. And everything I share with you is based on some primary source document I have read. Um, and I'm also open to being corrected. So if I come off as being arrogant and you think that you couldn't correct me, please do. But just make sure whatever you tell me is supported by some type of primary source document. I need data from the horse's mouth. So if you have data and I give a wrong date or historic information and you have the primary source or a reliable source to correct me, by all means, please do. And I'm not saying that as a challenge. I'm saying please do because I learn from my mistakes. Okay, so that disclaimer's out the way. Let's talk about President's Day. Now, first, it was created to honor George Washington. Now, some people will say, "Oh, he owned slaves. I'm not gonna honor George Washington. He wasn't my first president." Well, if you live in the United States, he was. He's the first president of the United States. Even though we can technically say he wasn't really my ancestors' president because we weren't considered human at the time he was president. And even though many of us were helping him do everything he did, like if you look at this painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware, you're going to see a black man in the boat. And he was there serving in the Revolutionary War on supporting George Washington's work. But because the Revolutionary War only freed the Europeans and not the black people, not even those who were fighting mostly, he wasn't really the president of us because we were like farm animals. We weren't people. So the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, even though it says all men are created equal, they didn't consider us men. They didn't consider us humans. So it doesn't really technically apply to us. But now that we are considered citizens, thanks to Abraham Lincoln, which we'll get to in a minute, um, it sort of applies to us. And so everything I share is not based on my experience as a black woman who every single ancestor was enslaved. It is based on the concept of what is the United States, what is America, right? And that's just real. This James Baldwin says, even though, and this is my whole summary of his statement, even though we get really frustrated with this place, it's not been really kind to us as a people. It is the only country I will ever know. It is the only home I will ever have. My roots are so rooted deep in this soil. I'm not going to live anyplace else but here, most likely. So I'm embracing America with all of its flaws as my home. So everything I'm sharing is based on the concept of America, not on necessarily the history of America in relation to me as a black woman. Okay, so I'll sprinkle some truths in there as I'm talking about history so you know where I'm coming from. But George Washington was the first president of America. Like, yes, he owned slaves, but he was. He was the first president of America. And and he also led the fight in the Revolutionary War. And he did it in a really sacrificial way because he wasn't quite sure where he stood on all this. He struggled with being a loyalist to the crown and also knowing there needed to be this country. And so he made this choice to fight for America's independence. And he did a valiant fight. He was a very smart, strategic military leader, and eventually became a really great leader for the country. And so, because just like Columbus was the first to kind of pave the way for this Western civilization expansion, thus bringing forth the United States eventually, George Washington was the first to really fight for the country and was part of that process for creating the framework for our country. And so he gets a holiday because these holidays that are chosen are about people who really did something physically, politically, legislatively, to really establish us as the United States of America. And George Washington was the first to physically and legislatively do that for this country. And try to swallow, if you're an African American with enslaved ancestors, try to swallow and just hear what I'm saying historically. So he gets a holiday. Now, Abraham Lincoln also gets a holiday because he kind of picks up the work of George Washington. George Washington, along with Thomas Jefferson and many others, they created this framework that they thought would really unify us as a country, trying to denounce everything that used to be in the country they were fleeing from, so that we wouldn't fall into that trap of having a national religion, and that there would be one king who controlled everything, that people had a voice as opposed to being oppressed. And it's so interesting. Phyllis Wheatley wrote a letter during the Revolutionary War honoring George Washington, but she also wrote letters to others in the Revolutionary time of the Revolutionary War saying, as you fight for freedom, please remember us. They forgot for a couple hundred years, but eventually it came to pass. So George Washington and them tried to create this framework. Now, Abraham Lincoln looks at that framework and realizes we're not quite functioning in the original vision of the founding fathers. And he makes this statement, if I could save America without freeing the slaves, I would, which kind of gives you a clue on he didn't quite see us as completely as human as him, but he recognized that we were living in a country that was very divided, and that there were human beings or people that kind of look like human beings here that we have to account for. There is a little sarcasm in my voice, but it's just true. And our country was failing economically. It was failing emotionally. Its unity wasn't strong because of a lot of things. And one of those things was slavery. And so to pick up where George Washington and the other founding fathers left off, he instigates another major war, this time internally, the Civil War, which ended slavery and started this process of making everyone be eligible to be a citizen. I'm just going to leave that there. So Abraham Lincoln gets a holiday, not because he just loved Black people so much that he freed us from slavery. That's not the true story. Now, you can tell by his speeches that he was going through a journey where God was doing something with him internally, but sadly his life was taken before we could really see what that was going to look like. But we see signs of him changing mentally, spiritually, inside. But that Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War, ended slavery forever. And ended this divide between the North and the South. We were now truly what the America's founding fathers envisioned, the United States. So he gets a holiday. And so through George Washington, through Abraham Lincoln, America's existence was solidified forever. So they deserve a holiday. They get a holiday in spite of their views on me individually. But America's not always about me as the individual. It's a more general or broader understanding of what this country is and our constant fight to be what the original vision was. So that's how we got President's Day.